The humidity in the dense Gabonese jungle was suffocating, a thick blanket of heat that clung to the skin. But for the team of 4 scientists crouching in the undergrowth, the sweat dripping into their eyes wasn't due to the temperature. It was pure, adrenaline-fueled fear. They were trespassers here. This was the territory of the lowland gorilla, creatures of immense power and unpredictability. Leading the expedition was Elias Thorne, a man whose weathered face usually held a calm assurance. Today, however, his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the telephoto lens on his camera. He wasn't just looking for any gorilla. He was looking for a ghost from his past. "Elias," whispered Dr. Aris Thorne, the team's lead behaviorist, her voice barely audible over the buzzing insects. "This is madness. It's been 10 years. In the wild, 10 years is a lifetime. She won't know you. At best, she'll flee. At worst, she's a dominant female now protecting her troop. If she sees you as a threat, we are all in serious trouble." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. How do you explain to a scientist that you feel a gravitational pull toward a creature you haven't seen since it was the size of a human toddler? The scientific consensus was clear. Once rewilded, the animal resets. The human connection is severed for survival. But Elias was gambling everything, his reputation, his safety, and the safety of his team, on the fragile hope that the consensus was wrong. He was betting on a memory buried under a decade of wild instinct. Then the foliage ahead snapped. A massive shadow detached itself from the green wall of the jungle, the air instantly filled with the musky scent of silverback. They had found them, or rather, the gorillas had found them. And what happened in the next 5 minutes would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the untamed mind. To understand the magnitude of this encounter, we have to travel back 10 years to a dusty makeshift wildlife sanctuary on the edge of the Congo Basin. Elias Thorne wasn't a world-renowned biologist then. He was just a young man with a surplus of empathy and a broken-hearted baby gorilla named Juma. Juma had been rescued from the hands of poachers, a shivering, terrified ball of black fur who refused to eat or sleep unless she was being held. For 3 years, Elias became her world. He didn't just feed her, he became her surrogate family. He slept on a cot outside her enclosure, spent his afternoons teaching her how to forage for wild celery, and endured the playful, bone-crushing hugs that only a growing gorilla can give. Their bond was so profound that critics at the time warned Elias he was humanizing her too much, claiming she would never survive the transition back to the forest. But Elias knew Juma belonged to the trees, not to him. When the day finally came to release her into a protected reserve in Gabon, it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He watched from a distance as she climbed into the canopy, her dark eyes looking back at him one last time before disappearing into the emerald labyrinth. For a decade, Elias lived with a hollow space in his chest, wondering if she had survived, if she was leading a troop, or if she had simply forgotten the man who saved her. The scientific community insisted that gorillas live in the now, that their memories of humans fade as survival instincts take over. But Elias had never been one to follow the consensus. Now, standing in the middle of that same jungle 10 years later, he was about to put his heart on the line to find out if love could transcend a decade of wild silence. The silence that followed the snapping of the branch was absolute. In the jungle, silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a warning. The birds had stopped their chatter, and even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Then the foliage parted like a heavy green curtain, and he stepped into the small clearing, a massive silverback, the undisputed king of this stretch of the Gabon forest. He was a mountain of muscle and silver-tipped fur, weighing easily 400 pounds. This was the troop leader, a male the researchers had nicknamed Coda. He didn't charge, but his presence was a physical weight. He stood on all fours, his knuckles dug into the soft earth, his amber eyes scanning the intruders with a mixture of boredom and lethal calculation. Behind him, the shadows shifted, revealing the rest of the troop, several females and 2 rambunctious juveniles who quickly scrambled behind their mothers. "Don't move," Elias whispered, his voice steady despite the hammer thumping of his heart. "Lower your eyes. Don't look at Coda directly. We are guests in his house." The team obeyed, bowing their heads in a submissive posture. For several agonizing minutes, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the silverback. Coda let out a low, guttural huff, a sound that vibrated in the chests of the humans. It was a warning, but also an invitation to remain, provided they kept their place. That's when Elias saw her. She was sitting slightly apart from the main group, half hidden by the broad leaves of a wild ginger plant. She was much larger than the baby Juma he carried in his arms a decade ago. She was a mature, powerful female now, her fur thick and healthy, her movements deliberate and regal. She was nursing a small infant, cradling the tiny creature with a tenderness that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. Elias felt a rush of heat behind his eyes. It was her. He knew the slight notch in her left ear from a childhood injury and the way she tilted her head when she was curious. The consensus said she would see him as a predator, or at best a strange feature of the landscape. But Elias remembered the way she used to tuck her head under his chin when she was scared. He took a slow, calculated risk. He began to make a low, repetitive vocalization, a specific series of soft grunts he had used every single morning at the sanctuary to greet her. Uh-huh, uh-huh. The effect was instantaneous. Juma's head snapped up. Her eyes, previously fixed on her infant, locked onto the man crouched 30 feet away. The other gorillas remained still, but Juma's entire posture changed. She handed her infant to an older female nearby, an act of trust that stunned Dr. Aris, and stood up. She didn't beat her chest, she didn't scream. Instead, she took a single, hesitant step toward the humans. Coda, the silverback, let out a sharp bark of disapproval, but Juma ignored him. She was focused entirely on the bearded man who was making a sound she hadn't heard in 10 long years. The air felt as if it were charged with electricity. Juma's eyes were narrowed, not in aggression, but in an intense, analytical stare. She moved with a fluid, heavy grace, closing the gap between the wild and the remembered. Every step she took away from the protection of the troop and toward Elias was a defiance of nature's hardest laws. Dr. Aris reached out to grab Elias's sleeve, her voice a frantic, breathy whisper. "Elias, stop, she's too close, Coda is going to react." But Elias didn't stop the vocalizations. He stayed low, making himself small, showing his palms in a gesture of absolute vulnerability. Juma stopped just 5 feet away. The smell of the wild, damp earth, crushed leaves, and the musky scent of a primate was overwhelming. She leaned forward, her nostrils flaring. She was catching the scent of the man who had been her mother, her father, and her protector. Then the impossible happened. Juma reached out a massive, leathery hand. For a second, the team braced for a strike, expecting the raw power of a wild animal. Instead, she gently extended her index finger and touched the silver locket hanging around Elias's neck, the same locket he had worn every day at the sanctuary, which she used to chew on as a restless infant. A soft, melodic hoo escaped her throat. It wasn't a wild call, it was a greeting. Elias felt tears blurring his vision. "Hey, girl," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you I'd find you." The silverback Coda let out a thunderous roar and slammed his fists into the ground, a display of power to remind everyone who was in charge. The team flinched, but Juma didn't move. She turned her head slightly toward the silverback and gave a sharp, authoritative grunt, a back-off signal that stunned the researchers. She was protecting Elias. She turned back to him and did something that left the scientists speechless. She sat down directly in front of him, mimicking his posture. She reached out and delicately began to pick a piece of dried leaf from his beard, just as she used to groom him a decade ago. It was a bridge built of memory, spanning 10 years of separation. In that moment, the boundary between species vanished, and the wild was replaced by a deep, ancient friendship. Before we reveal what Juma did next, something so human, it changed the way we look at primate intelligence forever. We wanted to take a second to say thank you for being here. Stories like this remind us that we are all connected in ways we don't fully understand. If you feel that connection too, if your heart beat a little faster seeing Juma recognize her old friend, we'd love to have you as part of our community. Click that subscribe button and join our family of explorers. And please, share a piece of your heart in the comments. Have you ever had a bond with an animal that felt like it defied logic? We read every single one of your stories, and honestly, hearing from you is the best part of our day. The grooming session was enough to bring the research team to tears, but Juma wasn't finished. She stood up, her massive frame casting a long shadow over Elias, and looked back toward the older female who was still holding her infant. With a series of soft, urgent grunts, she beckoned the other gorilla forward. The team held their breath. In the world of primatology, a wild mother presenting her newborn to a human is practically unheard of. It is the ultimate vulnerability. The older female was hesitant, her eyes darting toward the silverback Coda for permission. Coda, seemingly pacified by Juma's calm demeanor, sat back on his haunches, his heavy brow relaxed. He watched with a gaze that seemed more curious than protective. Juma took the infant, a tiny, wide-eyed creature with tufts of chaotic black hair, into her arms. She walked back to Elias and did something that would later be described in scientific journals as a total breakdown of the wild human barrier. She didn't just show him the baby. She sat down and nudged the infant toward Elias's chest, leaning her own heavy head against his shoulder. She's introducing him to you, Dr. Aris whispered, her voice trembling. Elias, she's showing you her legacy. Elias reached out, his movements slow and reverent. The infant gorilla reached out a tiny, perfect hand and wrapped a single finger around Elias's thumb. The grip was surprisingly strong, a primitive reflex, but the eye contact from Juma was purely intentional. She was looking at Elias with a depth of emotion that defied any clinical description. It wasn't just a memory of a caretaker, it was the recognition of a soul. For the next hour, the impossible became the reality. The rest of the troop, seeing their queen and king so relaxed, began to edge closer. The two juveniles, emboldened by the lack of tension, began to play wrestle just a few feet from the scientists. The jungle, which had felt like a place of danger only moments ago, had transformed into a sanctuary of mutual respect. The scientists sat in a daze, their cameras forgotten for a moment. They weren't just witnessing a reunion, they were witnessing a shift in the understanding of consciousness. Juma wasn't acting on instinct. She was acting on a complex emotional history. She remembered the milk, the warmth and the safety Elias had provided when she was a broken orphan, and she was choosing to extend that safety to him in her own world. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long golden fingers of light through the canopy, Elias sat in the dirt, leaning against a wild female gorilla holding the hand of her child. He realized then that the experts were wrong. Animals don't just live in the now. They live in a world of stories, of gratitude, and of bonds that time and the wild can never truly erase. As the shadows deepened and the jungle choir of frogs and nightbirds began to rise, Elias knew it was time to leave. To stay any longer would be to push the limits of Coda's patience and the delicate balance of the wild. Slowly he stood up, the infant gorilla returning to Juma's protective embrace. The walk back to the research camp was conducted in a silence that was heavy with awe. No one spoke because there were no words in the scientific lexicon to describe what they had just witnessed. Dr. Aris would later write in her report that standard metrics of animal behavior failed to account for the depth of the emotional reciprocity displayed in that clearing. But for Elias, it wasn't about data or metrics. It was about the look in Juma's eyes, a look that said, "I remember, and you are still mine." Elias Thorne returned to his life, but he was a different man. He continued his work in conservation, but with a new quiet fire. He knew now that every animal they protected wasn't just a biological unit in an ecosystem, but a being capable of profound love and historical memory. Juma remained in the heart of the Gabon forest, leading her troop and raising her son in the world where she belonged. Sometimes when the wind is right and the moon is full, the rangers near the reserve say they hear a specific type of vocalization coming from the deep forest, a soft, rhythmic uh-huh. It is a song of memory, a testament to a man who refused to forget a beast, and a beast who proved that the heart has a language all its own. The story of Elias and Juma reminds us that we are not as separate from the natural world as we like to think. We are all part of a grand interconnected tapestry where kindness is never wasted. And a bond forged in love is a bond that can survive even a decade of wild silence.